Great. Well, thanks very much, Hillary, and welcome to everybody. My name is Tim Dillingham. I'm the Executive Director for the American Littoral Society. We are a coastal conservation organization based in Highlands, New Jersey. And let me just say at the onset of this that I hope you're joining us today finds you all healthy and safe, and your loved ones as well in these very uncertain times. This is a new thing for us, coming to you from the comfort of my own home. I am very happy today to be joined by Janet to hopefully have a good time talking about fascinating creatures, a wonderful place, and some beautiful art. Janet?
Greetings. Thank you, Tim, for inviting me to share this special time with you. I am out on the West Coast on the banks of the North Shore of the Columbia River in the state of Washington. Our red knots that stage in Willapa Bay and Grays Harbors have just started arriving right on time. So I'm far away from them because of all the same reasons that you are very far from the red knots and the horseshoe crabs on the beach these days in New Jersey. And I very much appreciate the honor of being here. Thank you.
That's great. Well, we're really glad to have you. And I'm really looking forward to the chance for you to share your art and your work because it's really just been wonderful. You know, the American Littoral Society is a non-governmental organization. We have a funny name. I always joke that if you weren't raised by Jacques Cousteau, you may not know what the name of the word littoral means, but it means of or along the shoreline. And that's where we do our work. We concentrate mainly in the mid-Atlantic, New York, New Jersey region, which makes us lucky enough to be working on the Delaware Bay. And we do our work through education, conservation, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today, and policy and advocacy work. And not only is the Delaware Bay one of the more wonderful places that we have a chance to work in, but it contains some of the most fascinating creatures, two of whom live together in a very intricate relationship, a very intricate and delicate relationship that we're going to talk about today, the horseshoe crabs and the red knots. The horseshoe crab has been called a living fossil, generally is unchanged over 350 million years. It has one of my favorite names of Limulus polyphemus, named after the Cyclops in the Odyssey, because of the eyes. And the horseshoe crab has played a tremendous role in medical research for the benefit of people understanding how eyes work and how eyes are structured. It comes ashore in the springtime in the Delaware Bay onto the beaches to spawn. The females often lay up to 90,000 eggs. They depend upon having beaches in place to do that and being undisturbed. At the same time, this wonderful bird, the red knot, who is one of the world's greatest long-distance travelers, is on his or her way from the tip of South America and Tierra del Fuego, almost 9,300 miles to ultimately do its nesting and hatching in the Arctic. The Delaware Bay is a stopover site, and at times they say that almost 90% of the population of many of the shorebirds and migratory birds that come up the Atlantic coast find their way to the Delaware Bay. And they're there at the same time that the horseshoe crabs are laying their eggs, and they use those eggs, which are very high in proteins and fats, to refuel on their way back up to the Arctic. The other horseshoe crab has been much maligned. People are afraid of its kind of prehistoric appearance at times, but it's been used from everything from fertilizer to bait. And unfortunately, at times, we haven't managed those uses very well. Horseshoe crab populations have crashed, and unfortunately, they've taken the red knots and other migratory shorebirds with them, leading to the red knot being recognized by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as endangered or threatened under the Endangered Species Act. which has led to some of the work that we're going to talk about after Janet shares her art with us. So this is a wonderful place, has amazing creatures in it, but also is a case study in our responsibilities to the natural world, and really shows us how, when we don't take care of things, nature falls apart. But I think it also is a story of hope, because of the work that's been done, and hopefully will help this wonderful bird on its journey, as well as the continued presence of this amazing living fossil. Janet?
And I'm going to take just a second here and start the slideshow.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be with you today. It's a very special time of year when the red knots, who you can see here, are coming to Delaware Bay. And I've been invited to share with you my work about the red knots. They are, for the last 7 years, I've been working on a project that I call the Cultural Cartography of Red Knots. In it, I am trying to describe the scientific knowledge of red knots and the many locales around the world where they inhabit some or another part of the year by way of art native to that area. Now, here's a brief picture of our time of year right now, when the moon calls the horseshoe crabs up from the bottom of the ocean to the beach, and the same time calls the red knots from the tip of South America to Delaware Bay. So let's see the map, the next slide of the map. This is a regular sort of map of red knots worldwide. You can see they are on every continent but Australia, and do the major flyways on east and west sides of the Americas, the Atlantic shore of Africa and Europe, and the Pacific shore of Asia and down to New Zealand. So I've had lots of place to work with on my cultural cartography of red knots. Today I'm just going to share some of the 43 paintings I've done so far with you from Rufa, the subspecies of red knots that we'll find in Delaware Bay. So, next slide. Where better to start than in Delaware Bay? And what better style of art to start with than that of John James Audubon, a native of the eastern part of the United States. He was working actually in the great tradition, European tradition of the artist, naturalist, scientific illustrators of the 16, 17, and 1800s. But he added his own unique artwork to that tradition with his use of adding the habitat that his birds are in to his pictures. Those of you who may recognize picture, I think it's 319, plate 319 in his Birds of America, will recognize these two red knots. This is a mirror image of Audubon's pictures on a beach of Delaware Bay. The engraving process which Audubon used makes the edges of the paintings a little bit, we call it hard in the art world, and his poses, the poses of his birds can be a bit stiff because of his process, which was to shoot the birds, stuff them, pose them before he painted them. He interestingly did not put any horseshoe crabs in his painting. I have added the cityscape in the background and the horseshoe crabs on the faraway beach in this painting. He had to walk to where he was finding birds and shooting them for his work. And so it's very possible that at the time that he was around Delaware Bay, researching birds of that area. He just did not happen on a beach or a time when the horseshoe crabs were there. But I felt it was important, for the obvious reasons, to add a horseshoe crab. They came and went with the tides in this painting. One of the wonders of acrylic paints is you can instantly sort of erase any mistakes. So horseshoe crabs were all over this painting at one time or another, and they finally settled down to this empty horseshoe crab over in the corner for a variety of complicated art reasons. But I think it serves as a interesting reference to the connection of these two species. And if there are no horseshoe crabs, there will be no red knot. So I want to show you another painting from that I associate with this area. This painting I call Red Knots Descending the Beach, and I've tried to capture in it some of the frenzy of a flock of red knots following the water as the tide recedes. Now, red knots amongst shorebirds are some of the fastest peckers when they are foraging. They've been clocked at up to 10 pecks per second. Down at the tip of the beak of one of the birds, you can see 10 tiny little dots. If you try jabbing your finger at 10 jabs per second, you'll know it's a really fast speed. Red knots prefer to forage during the day. They have 3 foraging strategies. One can be pecking by sight if they can see their prey, such as horseshoe crabs on the beach. They do random foraging, pecking into the sand where they can't see prey. And they also have a technique used in the proper habitat where they're sort of plowing through the sand with their beak because they have an organ on the end of their beak which allows them to detect water pressure changes between places in the sand where there's a mollusk who's potential food and not. So there's sort of a red knot equivalent of bat hunting by sonar. So why this style? This is patterned after a very famous painting by a French artist named Marcel Duchamp, but it was first shown in New York City, just up the coast from you, in 1908 at a show called the Armory Show. At the time, it caused a huge scandal because nobody could understand what it was. It was modern, incomprehensible art. Today, any of us would look at it and say it is clearly a picture of a human form divided into a variety of planes walking down a diagonal staircase. But at the time, it caused a scandal. So I painted this, Red Knots Descending the Beach. It's an art joke in honor of that painting and of the Armory Show. Because of complicated art reasons, the background around the birds became rather dark, but it's a good reference to red knots foraging at night if necessary. They forage on the low tide, so their time of eating is determined by the tides in any given day and place. Why might they forage at night? Next slide. Well, they might be foraging at night because they have just flown 3,000 or 5,000 miles from someplace in South America and they're starving. They have migrated up the coast from Tierra del Fuego and someplace in northern Argentina or Uruguay or southern Brazil. They have began this huge jump up to the east coast of the United States. They have gotten fattened up on available food. They have shed all extra unnecessary baggage. They've reduced the size of their digestive organs. They've atrophied muscles in their legs, gotten rid of everything that is not necessary for flight. And they've taken to the air. They've been tracked with geolocators as being in the air for up to 6 days at a time flying through the night, through the sunshine, through storms. They can shed excess heat through their legs, shown in this painting. When I started this painting, I was fascinated by the idea that that the birds were able to manage these long distance multi-day flights because they could catch sleep by having half of their brain take naps at any given time while the other half is staying awake. Since then, and because of technological devices that can measure brain waves and are small enough for birds to carry, scientists are, I believe, pretty certain that the birds are actually staying awake and alert for 6 days in a row, as unimaginable as that would be to us. Now, Brazil is a big place. There are lots of people, lots of styles of art that have been practiced there over time. But one of my favorite Brazilian artists is a contemporary folk artist named Jose Francisco Borges, who works in woodblock prints and is internationally known. So using his playful and bold style, I made this flock of red knots. You can see they're getting kind of skinny because of flying so long. So that's why they might be foraging at night. If they happen to arrive in Delaware Bay at night, they need to eat. They need to quickly, in just a few weeks, gather back their original weight, gain more weight, more fat, so that they can fly another 1,000 or 2 miles up to the northern part of the Canadian Arctic, and still have enough resources that if they arrive while there's still snow on the ground and the insects haven't hatched, that they can survive. So, skipping Delaware Bay right now, we're heading on to the Arctic with the next slide of birds in the tundra. In a few short weeks, they establish nesting territories miles apart. They find mates, they make nests, they hatch eggs, and the chicks start to walk. Now, this looks like a very simplified drawing, but but that's only because it's a huge magnification of what would have been a tiny drawing with incised lines on bone or ivory. Inuit artists have been practicing incision for thousands of years. Their very, very careful observation of the creatures around them in the Arctic have led them to making these small and very precise, intimate drawings of the life of beings around them. So here you have a hen on a nest surrounded by the tundra dwarf willows and lichens, a bird distracting predators with a raised wing display, and the chicks beginning to walk. It is not the only style of art practiced by Inuit artists. Next slide, please. A lot of Inuit art is sculptural, so a little bit tricky to translate into a painting, but contemporary artists do many things, one of which this is an example of a wall hanging done with cloth applique and embroidery that would have been adapted from skills for clothing manufacture in traditional times, and has been adapted to life in frame houses where you can hang things on the wall. Having done a fair bit of applique and embroidery in my time, I appreciate the mastery of it. And I discovered while doing this that it takes as long time to paint a whole mess of tiny little embroidery stitches as it does to actually do them. But this painting describes the red knots after they hatch. They're able to walk and feed themselves as soon as they hatch, but they're unable to regulate body temperature for a few days, so they need to stay with an adult. which is likely to be the male, because the females, who have used up to 1/3 of their body mass laying their clutch of 3 to 4 eggs, leave the Arctic as soon as the chicks hatch to go and refuel so they can prepare for their southern migration. The males stay with the chicks, and practically as soon as they're born, they start walking from their nesting sites inland, in the upland, higher up regions than the beach. They start walking to the coast, and you can see that from the upper left corner, the little track of the knots through the tundra on those tiny little chick legs, where they have to get through the tundra, avoiding Jaegers and foxes and other obstacles in the tundra, which might be loss of vegetation that they can use for camouflage, because grubbing snow geese have taken away all the vegetation. So 3 weeks after they hatch, they're ready to fly, and off they go. Next slide. Some of the red knots will go down to the southern end of Hudson Bay to stage for the southern migrations, and others of them from the Canadian Arctic go to the end of the mouth of the St. Lawrence River in an area called the Mingan Archipelago. They arrive in 3 waves. First, the female, this bird shown with the circles in her yellow belly, then the males, and then finally the chicks. Red knots are really hard to find if you're a scientist walking about in the Arctic trying to find their nests. So if your goal was to understand breeding success in any given year, doing it by locating nests is a really hard thing to do. And it was only recently, which one of your East Coast biologists, Larry Niles, on a bird found with the radio tag put on in Delaware Bay, found an active nest in the Arctic. But scientists have extrapolated from this process where the birds migrate in the waves of the females, the males, and the juveniles, breeding success from the staging grounds before they're headed south, so that if they find a first wave of females and then later a wave of males, it's because the males have been raising chicks. If the males are arriving with the females, it's because they didn't have anything to do. And so it's likely that breeding season that year was a failure. So in my cultural cartography, there's actually very few paintings that are of maps, and this is one of them. The circles on the left in the green area, that's the green tundra, and those circles represent their nesting sites. The circle at the top between green tundra and blue ocean is the Mingan Archipelago, and the circles on the right in the blue ocean are the stopover sites that the birds will follow on their way to South America. I fell in love with the work of a brilliant First Nations artist from Quebec named Norval Morisseau years ago. It was a delight to use his shapes and colors in this painting. It was also a delight when I discovered the anchor of this painting, which held it all together, which is that strange orange space between the bird's wings. I was in 5th grade when I discovered that I hated the colors purple and orange together. So this was not something I expected, but that's one of the wonderful things about doing art, is that many unexpected things happen, and this was one of them. The birds that use the Mingan Archipelago as a staging ground are going to fuel up. The young ones, which have only been eating insects and have never had to use a gizzard before to grind mollusk shells, are going to have to grow that and learn how to use it. All the birds are going to fatten up as much as possible, and then they're going to take off for South America in the middle of the Atlantic hurricane season. So besides the distance they have to fly, they're also going to have to contend with storms. The birds migrate by celestial navigation, by their sense of the magnetism of the earth, and by other wisdom that we don't know about yet. But they are able to keep track of their location over the broad Atlantic Ocean. And if they are blown off course by hurricanes, they are able to readjust their heading to where they are attempting to go. The first stop of which will be, if they have enough fuel to make it, will be the next slide, which is the coast, the northern coast of South America, Suriname, and Guyana. The birds are going to arrive starving and exhausted. They need to eat. Any amount of time spent avoiding disturbance, they are not being able to replenish their food supplies, and they're wasting precious energy. So this painting, this circuitous loopy path through this painting represents a bird disturbed on the beach. In New Jersey, on the shore, those disturbances might be people walking dogs, people jogging, people out enjoying the beach. Where I live, it might be windsurfers or cars driving on the beach. In Suriname and the Caribbean, it might be sports hunters from Europe, or it might be on the opposite end of the financial scale, people who must live on a poverty diet where shorebirds are an addition of protein. But conservationists have been working for many years to protect shorebirds from hunting, and many years to educate the public about the needs of shorebirds, so hunters or no, people are respecting the needs of birds when they are migrating along our various many coasts. This painting celebrates and commemorates those efforts. The target shape in the center is my symbol for hunting, but I want to remind everybody that hunters, through their fees and licenses and taxes, provide lots of financial support for wildlife refuges. Bird watchers, hikers, nature lovers might also consider an equivalent amount of contribution. So when the birds leave South America, many of them will continue all down the coast to the far ends of the earth and Tierra del Fuego. Next slide. Evolutionary biologists think that humans may have arrived in Tierra del Fuego shortly after the shorebirds did, after the last ice age. The indigenous people of Tierra del Fuego undoubtedly knew of the seasonal presence of red knots and other shorebirds in their area, but it wasn't until the last 50 years that biologists knew about the shorebirds in the non-breeding season in Tierra del Fuego. Two Canadian biologists flew in small airplanes on the southern coast of Tierra del Fuego 40 years ago and finally found we call it wintering, but for the birds, it's just another summer. The areas where the huge non-breeding populations of red knots in the mudflats of the Magellan Straits. They were able to get baseline population counts from surveys for several years, and then suddenly those populations plummeted, and now the subspecies rufo, which uses the Atlantic coast of the Americas, is on the endangered species list. This painting describes that precipitous decline of red knots. There are some almost fully, completely painted birds coming in from the left, and a single completely painted bird in the hand in the bottom center of the painting, and then the birds migrating north are just shown as pink ovals. The indigenous people of Tierra del Fuego practiced body painting using very broad stripes of alternating dark and light colors, or large dots on a contrasting background. So I have used that broad stripe and dot style in this painting, but I have added to it, I hope, some of the dynamic and colorful mural aesthetic of the street murals of South America. In Chile, in street murals in the southern cities of Chile and Argentina, you can see murals which actually use photographs of the indigenous people, the Selknam people, with their body painting, and or talk about ocean rise and or extinctions caused by climate change. That is a worldwide conversation. And so with this last slide, I want to think about that conversation with this last slide. This references the mudflats of and wildlife areas of northern Tunisia, where birds that have come up from the Atlantic coast of southern Africa, flown across the Sahara Desert, and are staging for their trip across the Mediterranean to northern Europe. It was inspired by the work of a Tunisian French muralist whose calligraphic murals function as shape as well as words. I abandoned my attempt at learning to do Arabic calligraphy fairly quickly, since I didn't think I could do it justice. But I also thought, well, I could write English backwards to get some of that same sense of Arabic calligraphy, which I did in this painting. In another one of those wonderful art moments, after I was finished with it, I realized that I was following in the footsteps of another great Mediterranean artist, scientist, very well known, who wrote his notes backwards so that other people would not be able to steal his inventions, and that was Leonardo da Vinci. So what this painting clearly says, if you read from the top right to the left and a little bit of up to down, this says red knots, godwits, shorebirds, humans. We travel together into our future. Every piece of conservation that is done for shorebird habitat along the coast benefits us. As recent storms and tsunamis have shown, every piece of marsh and dune and wetland and mangrove is protective of us and the many resources that we use from the ocean for our benefit. So all conservation efforts are valuable. I want to leave you with that. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share some of these paintings with you. Many of you who would rather be out on the beaches turning horseshoe crabs and helping Brian and Amanda and Larry Niles capture shorebirds, band shorebirds at the moment, have held shorebirds in your hand, so you know them more intimately than I do. But I appreciate all your work with the biologists and with conservation groups such as the Littoral Society, and wherever you are, any conservation efforts that you support. So thank you very much. Back to Tim. Oh, but well, so speaking of that tagging, here's a tag in this slide on a bird leg and shorebirds, and a map which shows the geolocations of some of the migration flights of red knots up the East Coast. Next.
Tim, you're on mute.
I've lost audio.
Tim, there you go.
You hear myself? Okay, you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, great. All right, so I muted myself just so my expressions of admiration for the artwork wouldn't escape in the middle of Janet's presentations. Those are beautiful. I will say personally, you know, I have always found art in the handiwork of nature, right? It is just amazing, both in form and function, but your work and the respect that you showed to the cultures in which the birds travel through is just really, really admirable. And the fact that you came to love purple and orange together, I thought was a great story. So this is just, as Janet said, this is just to kind of get into some of the conservation work aspect of it. And I would like to thank her also for her message of that the conservation and particularly how we address and hopefully wrestle down the changing climate is truly a worldwide conversation. And I think we probably don't know how much nature touches us, although we are learning very hard lessons, I think, in the possible ideas that the COVID virus came from in, breaking down the barriers between isolated habitats and animals and humanity. If I got the next slide, Hillary. So, I want to talk about some of the work that we're doing along the Delaware Bay to try to conserve and restore these amazing animals, both the horseshoe crabs and the migratory shorebirds. And first I want to acknowledge and just pay my respects to my partners in this work, or our partners in this work. Janet mentioned Dr. Larry Niles, Dr. Amanda Dye, Dr. Joe Smith, many others, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, whose biologists and resource managers have been tremendous partners in the work that I'm going to mention to you, as well as the local communities. The Littoral Society has been involved in horseshoe crab conservation for many years, mainly in the early into mid-90s around the overharvesting of horseshoe crabs for the bait industry, the impact that had on the red knots and other shorebirds. The numbers, of course, are often difficult to get very firm because as a nation, we underinvest in the science and the conservation work that needs to be done to really understand the complexities of these animals and their movements. But there are estimates that the red knots in the early 1980s populations often were around 95,000. And yet when a really aggressive fishery started in the Delaware Bay for horseshoe crabs to be used as bait to catch whelk, the numbers crashed and hit a low point in 2007 of around 12,000. So you can see how rapidly these animals can be pushed to just the brink of extinction. And we were involved in efforts to enact moratoriums on the bait harvest in New Jersey and Delaware, and the Delaware Bay itself, working on the listing so that we could gain the protections of the Endangered Species Act. And we did some science early on around the habitat aspect of how do we support the vitality of the horseshoe crab spawn and make that an element of the conservation and recovery. And in a kind of bizarre way, the opportunity really came after Hurricane Sandy. And I'll show you the next picture, but one of the impacts of Sandy, which came roaring right across the middle of New Jersey, was that it stripped the sand from the beaches on the Delaware Bay, which are the spawning sites for the horseshoe crabs. And as Janet so well explained to us, critical stopover site for them on their migratory pathways. So the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Army Corps of Engineers, the states of New Jersey in particular, and then some private foundations, the William Penn Foundation, the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation, all recognized that, on the heels of a storm that hit us in October, we had to get these beaches ready for an event that was going to occur in April, May, and June. So we launched into an effort to restore the beaches on an emergency basis, which then grew into a program that you can see some of the results described on the left-hand side there, to really restore the habitat values, try to enhance them where we could, and to manage them as an important element of the conservation and protection of both the horseshoe crabs and the red knots. So to date, we've restored about 3¼ mile of beaches. We've taken lots and lots of rubble off the beach. There's been years of people desperately throwing things onto the beach in the hopes that it would stop the beach erosion and protect some of the small communities that are down there. We found that as we brought in lots and lots of sand, built oyster reefs to help protect the beaches, tagged the horseshoe crabs to understand their use of beaches and their fidelity to them, that those natural features not only were helping the horseshoe crabs and the red knots, but we're also protecting the communities. So there is that, again, that interrelationship between conservation and what touches all of us as people in society. Have the next slide, please. This just is to give you, some context as to where the Delaware Bay, if you're not familiar with it, occurs. We often call it the hidden coast. As you can imagine, in a state with 8 million people, people are very much on top of each other for the vast majority of the state. But the Delaware Bay is just an amazing place in its natural beauty, its openness, its rural character. And not many people know about it, which probably has been to its benefit in many ways. The beaches, the graphic's not great, and I apologize for that, but the beaches that are on the right-hand side there are the beaches in that western side of the Cape May Peninsula, where the work has taken place and which are really the prime horseshoe crab beaches, in addition to the ones that are on the Delaware side of the bay. Next slide. And this just gives you a sense of what that work looked like. The top row of pictures are the beaches right after the hurricane came through. As you can see, very beat up, stripped down to the peat layers, historic peat layers that were there in many cases. And then the work that we came in and did, restoring the beach profiles themselves along the lower line there. And then I always like the one in the corner, in the right corner, which just shows you how the horseshoe crabs responded to the work itself. Next slide. And this just is just to give you a sense of how it's actually done. And I like to show this because environmentalists don't often get involved in a positive way with heavy construction equipment. And so the sand is brought in from inland mines. We don't pump it out of the bay. And then is spread according to profiles that are developed by our partners at Stockton University. And part of the work that Dr. Niles and Dr. Smith had done as we've moved through what's going on 7 years now of this work is understanding which profiles work best to help support the viability of the eggs, the horseshoe crab eggs, and how thick it has to be, the grain size of the sand. It's a real science in and of itself, which as we did the work rebuilding, we were also monitoring, studying it, and those kind of lessons that we learned. Next slide, please. And again, this is what better habitat looks like. we found that in last year during the migration, most of the shorebirds concentrated and spent a majority of their time on the New Jersey side of the bay. Some of that may have to do with this disturbance that Janet mentioned. In New Jersey, they have a very active program of trying to keep people off the beach during the stopover period. It's education-based. People really quickly understand what's going on and appreciate it. There's opportunities to see the birds set up, but that and we think the quality of the beach in terms of the horseshoe crab spawn has really created a favorite dining spot for the birds. And there's lots of good biology on Dr. Niles's part and Dr. Smith's part, documenting sort of the facts of that, which I think is available in journals if you really want to get into the deep science of this. The next one, please, next slide. Again, just this strikes me as a juxtaposition. You know, I have to say my own personal career spent a lot of time again working against bulldozers and heavy equipment on the beach, but in this case, the work really was astounding. Another sort of ancillary benefit to this, not only in terms of the habitat restoration and the work it's hopefully contributing to the recovery of both the horseshoe crabs and the red knots, is that it put money into the local economy. Cumberland County, which is where most of these beaches are located, is the poorest county in New Jersey. And so the people who supplied the sand, the people who ran the bulldozers were all local businesses, and we were able to put millions of dollars over the course of the work into the local economy. And not only, and it's also contribute to the resiliency of some of the towns and communities that were there. Next slide. And this is sort of just the parting shot to what it's all about. Janet mentioned, Larry, Dr. Niles is down on the beach today. Birds are starting to trickle in. The crabs are starting to come up. The bay water is still a little cold, so they haven't come up for a big spawn. But there really is nothing like holding one of those birds. I've been fortunate enough to be invited into some of the banding work a couple times over the years, and to sit there and hold a bird in your hands that's flown all that distance and has all that distance to go, and to know that you're helping to help them get on their way is really very gratifying. I always laugh when you'll hear the biologists, they're teamed up in a circle doing the banding and doing the metrics. Everybody will usually call out, well, here's a really fat one. And you can tell that was a crab that's benefited from, or a bird that's benefited from the work with the crabs. Next slide. I would just say that, from my perspective, there's still a lot of conservation work to be done. We still have concerns about the harvest levels of the horseshoe crabs, whether the horseshoe crab populations are sufficiently recovered to really fulfill the ecological goals and niches that they need to play in relationship to the birds. There's growing aquaculture industry in the foraging areas along the Delaware Bay. And then climate, of course, is changing. We think, or worried, the mechanics of the stopover. So while things have been very successful and people have come to understand the value of protecting and taking care of this wildlife, there's still lots of work to do. And people are coming together again to sort of renew the conservation effort to really make sure that this amazing phenomena that Janet captured so well in her artwork is something that we can pass on to everybody, to our kids, into the future. So I think we're going to take questions. I want to just thank Janet again for her part of this. Yes, thank you. The art's just amazing. Because you can tell, I'm very impressed by it. So Hillary, are you going to read questions or present questions to us?
Yes.
Okay.
So our first question, Janet, is for you. Is any of the artwork for sale?
The originals are not for sale until I have the opportunity to show them all together in one place. That's going to take some big wall space. You can see the original behind me of the picture patterned after Audubon. So that's the size of the originals, and they're all that same size and shape. I'll stand back here so you can see it. So all of them are that size. Making all of them the same size added some artistic constraints to what I was doing that have been very interesting. I have sold prints of them on a sort of piecemeal basis. I believe the Littoral Society is going to make a t-shirt available of one of them. There was an article in Orion magazine, the spring issue of Orion magazine, called Flight of the Red Knots by Deborah Kramer, that has some of the pictures in it. This is her book, The Narrow Edge, A Tiny Bird, An Ancient Crab, and an Epic Journey, which was invaluable for me when I did the paintings. But you can contact me via the website or via Gmail if you are interested in prints. I'm not a store. I'm computer challenged, so I don't take PayPal or any of that kind of stuff. So it's a very down-home operation as far as getting prints, but contact me if you're interested.
And Janet's contact information is up right now on the screen, so that's where you can find her. And I will say we do have the painting Endurance right now up on, it's bonfire.com. Is a direct-to-consumer fundraising t-shirt website. So that is available right now for purchase. A portion of the proceeds come to the Littoral Society in support of our conservation efforts. So if you go to our website that's up on the screen right now, littoralsociety.org, and scroll down just a little bit, there's a link to where to go to get the t-shirts right there on our homepage. And thank you very much to Janet for the use of her artwork in order to do that. We're very grateful. So the next question is, why do the red knots migrate to the Arctic to breed?
You want me to go, Tim, or do you want to go?
No, let's go for it.
So food. In the Arctic, you have the massive insect hatches of the brief summer months. You have few predators. You have lots of space. You have lots of light. So you have lots of time to see what you're trying to catch to eat. So it's a good place to spend a bit of time. There's a complicated relationship between the amount of energy it takes a bird to get to the Arctic and back again, and is the use of that energy most valuable in flying long distances or not? So one of the species of red knots that uses the Canadian, or subspecies that uses the Canadian Arctic, spends the winter in the British Isles. So it's colder. They have to spend more resources, more body resources during that time to maintain themselves. But the flight is shorter to the Arctic for the summer. So it's a trade-off, which strategy is most valuable. So as I understand biology, concepts are that following the last ice age, as what was Arctic tundra changed with the loss of the glaciers, birds would be along the tundra. as populations grew, they would have to expand their territory. So some birds might have gotten successfully farther and farther and farther away from the tundra over time, so that some of them were in South America, at the tip of South America. But we're remembering that migration route and how much fun it was eating insects in the Arctic, and what a good place to find lots of space to nest and stay away from each other. Most of the year they're in these huge groups, and then they decide to become prudes or something and go to the Arctic and have to nest very far away from each other. So.
All right. And then the next question is a pretty good, easy one. It's, do the red knots stop in Jamaica Bay?
Yes, but not in the big concentrations that they do on the Delaware Bay. They do spread out. They forage. They sort of range around and forage, but the big concentration of the stopovers on the Delaware Bay.
And then somebody asked if we're recording. We are recording, and we will share the recording on the Littoral Society's website and on our YouTube channel. And then a couple more. We've got just a few minutes left here. When do the red knots migrate back, and do they stop at the Delaware Bay going back and forth?
Do you want to take this?
No, that's fine, Janet.
Okay, so my understanding, some of the red knots that use the Atlantic Flyway will come down the eastern coast of the United States, and will stop at various places in Massachusetts and down through Delaware Bay and on down to South Carolina. And some of them will spend the winter on the southern coast of the United States. Others of them, the ones that go to many of them that go to the Mingan Archipelago, are going to skip over the United States altogether and go straight on to South America. So my understanding is you will find fewer numbers of them than in the spring, and more spread out along the coastline areas, and not coming in as huge a concentration at one time as you get in the spring.
And do they eat the same stuff?
And what?
Do they eat the same stuff? So because right now is horseshoe crab time, what do they eat when they're on their way back?
Red knots are selective molluscivores. So they're eating bivalves most of the time. They eat a lot of blue mussels and Dorsina clams, I think it is, along the East Coast, surf clams. And so they're eating what's available. The horseshoe crab egg event is a spring event. And so then the other parts of the year, they're eating mollusks.
Okay. So I'm hoping a couple of these questions can be answered quickly. We do have a hard stop in about a minute. What do we expect the peak date to be this year?
I don't know the answer to that. I can imagine that it's going to be the last week of May, early June, depending. But I think you're on uneasy ground when you try to predict it. And so, as I said, the crabs are slow coming up right now because of the water temperatures, and there are a few birds coming in. But it literally, I've had Larry describe it to me, saying that he woke up one morning and all the birds were there. And so I am not one to predict when the peak might be.
All right. Okay, and we did have a couple of other questions, but I'm so sorry we are out of time. If you want to send your questions in, if your question wasn't answered, you can send them either directly to Janet at her email address that's up on the screen, or to info@littoralsociety.org, and we will get all of your questions answered to the best of our ability. So thank you again, both Janet and Tim, for your time today, and everybody who came. We hope you enjoyed, and we had such a great response from this webinar. We're going to be hopefully doing an encore. So we've got to end now, but thank you everybody for coming today.
Great. Thank you all for coming.